The middle class. Most Canadians think they're part of it, and politicians like that just fine. But who really fits under this umbrella term, and how are they faring economically? Joining us now for more on the status of the Canadian dream, here's Brian Milner, business columnist at the Globe and Mail and one of the regulars around here once upon a time. It's great to see you again, Brian.
Same here, Steve.
Do you know where this expression, first of all, comes from, middle class?
Middle class, well, it really dates back to England originally in, I think, the 18th century when people started moving to towns and they had to come up with a different category. They had the landowners and they had the peasants. Well, who the heck were these people in the towns working in the cotton mills and all that stuff? And that was your original bourgeoisie, which basically means person who lives in the town. And it went from there really to the owners of businesses, because the upper class was certainly not going to dirty its hands with being merchants and stuff like that. So the original middle class were business owners. And it morphed from that. I mean, the Industrial Revolution came along, and then it became the white-collar workers in big industry. So you had managers. The managerial class was really your middle class.
Who's middle class today?
Well, today, I mean, it's a very subjective notion. Most people, as you said, think they're in it. If you define it, you could define it by income, and most people in the middle income brackets can legitimately call themselves middle class. But at one time, it didn't include blue-collar workers. Then the UAW came along and made blue-collar workers do very well. So, you know, your blue-collar neighbor could have a big car and a boat and a cottage. And
make $100,000 a year.
Exactly, and therefore they're middle class. Today, I think it still tends to be white-collar workers, civil servants, professions.
You want to put a number on it, though?
Well, believe it or not, the number of Canadians who think they're in the middle class has been dropping. It was as high as 66% earlier this century, and now it's down below 50%. About 47% of Canadians think they're in the middle class.
But if your household income is $120,000 a year, let's say, are you middle class?
Yes, you're still middle class. You're actually at the upper levels of middle classdom. If you're earning anything over $100,000 a year.
How about if you're a single person making 50 grand a year? Are you middle class?
Well, depending on what you do for a living, you can probably call yourself middle class.
Okay. We hear this all the time. The middle class is shrinking. But is it really?
Well, it depends, again, how you define middle class. If it's based on assets, there are people who should put themselves in the wealthier class. If you own a home in a nice neighborhood in Toronto, you really have assets that are worth more than any member of the middle class ever had in the 1960s. At the same time, you can be a technician who in the old days would have been part of the proletariat, but that technician might be earning $150,000 a year because they're computer savvy, they know what they're doing, and they're very valuable. Are not those middle class people? I think it's a matter of what your aspirations are, how you see yourself in society, because there's a social aspect to being in the middle class. All those things come into play.
Is it more a state of mind than a state of the bank account?
Well, I believe that it's more a state of mind for sure, because of that social part of it, and because of the aspirations you have for your family. If you're in the middle class, you're more likely to be more socially mobile than if you're at the bottom rungs of the ladder or at the top.
Here's something, sorry to do this to you, I'm going to quote something out of the National Post. I hate when we do that, when we have somebody from the Globe on and we quote the Post.
Have we not written enough about this?
You have. In fact, you know, Peggy Wendy wrote something just the other day about it. But anyway, here's what we pulled out of the National Post. The paycheck-to-paycheck myth. It shows the median net worth of Canadian families jumped 44.5% to just under $250,000 in the year 2012. That's up from $168,000 and change in 2005. Over the past 15 years, the median net worth figure leaps 80%. It found that families in the bottom quintile have seen their net worth decline slightly since 1999. Back then, the bottom 20% of families had a median net worth of $1,300. That dropped to $1,100 in 2005 and remained unchanged in 2012. Meanwhile, and this will not come as news, the wealthiest 20% of families in Canada possessed about 2/3 of the country's net worth in 2012. That was down from almost 70% in 2005. Consequently, the three middle quintiles which can roughly be defined as Canada's middle class, increased their share of the country's 8.07 trillion personal net worth by 1.8 percentage points. Okay, after it's all said and done, what does this tell you about the health of the middle class?
Well, that tells me that Stats Canada is putting a lot more emphasis on net worth than on net income. As I said, if you own a house in a major urban market in Canada, you're a lot wealthier than you were 3 years ago. I mean, there has been a huge increase in the value of property, and so your net worth's going to be higher. And I don't think it tells you very much about the earning capacity, the spending capacity, or the debt levels that a lot of people are carrying.
You said you pointed out it's a StatsCan survey where we get that information from. And given the changes that have happened to Statistics Canada, do you still have faith that these numbers mean something?
Well, I think they mean exactly what they say. The net worth of Canadians is higher than it was, except for the people at the bottom who don't own property, who don't have regular incomes or have incomes that are at minimum wage levels. They point out that the upper crust, the wealthiest part of the economy, that their income has dropped. Well, we're talking about in the wake of one of the world's worst recessions and a huge decline in the stock market. So their net worth, if it was based in equities, would have gone down. If they do that again this year, they'll find that they've gone back up because the market's had an incredible year.
You know Paul Adams? Guy used to be CBC News reporter.
He was a colleague of ours at the Globe, too.
He was, that's right, for a while. Yeah. University professor in Ottawa. Did a piece for iPolitics last month. I want to read you a little excerpt of that because, of course, who considers themselves middle class is a huge issue in politics on the national scene. Let's read this excerpt from Paul Adams. When I ask people why they think Justin Trudeau's Liberals target the middle class so relentlessly with their messaging, I invariably get the same reply. It's because everyone thinks of themselves as middle class. In other words, it's like those cheesy 3D movies in which a character points a finger at the audience, giving each of us the illusion of being singled out. The Liberals' middle class message actually conceals as much as it conveys. In part, that's because it's so unclear what we mean when we talk about the middle class. A doctor married to a lawyer may consider herself middle class, just like the guy on the assembly line at GM whose wife works in retail and who has seen his wages and benefits cut. They may both feel squeezed these days, but their preoccupations are likely to be quite different. But the more clearly the Liberals define their middle class pitch, the easier it will be for all of us to figure out who among us will benefit from their policies and who won't. Okay, let's pull this apart a little bit. To what extent do you think that it's in the best interests of politicians making a pitch for votes that Canadians see themselves as being middle class?
Well, I think that's the whole key to the Liberal plan, and it's borrowed largely from the Obama technique. Everybody thinks of themselves in some way, if not actually part of the middle class, they have the same aspirations as people in that class. That's what they want for their families and their children. So it makes sense to say, we are focused on your well-being, but if they start saying what that means in terms of policy, then they have problems. So the more vague you can keep it, the longer you can keep it, then you're in good shape. The problem is that in Canada we have three parties that are basically singing from the same songbook. The NDP is no longer the workers' party. They're like New Labour in Britain. They are appealing to the middle class, the people who feel that they're getting squeezed. And you can see that in the way they talk. And the Liberals have specifically targeted the middle class because they know that of all the people in Canada who are not feeling very well off, but have voting power, it's the middle class.
Do you see a distinction in the way that Conservatives, Liberals, New Democrats, and let's for the heck of it add the Greens as well, do you see a difference in the way that they are making their respective appeals to so-called middle-class people?
Well, there are some differences. The Conservatives always focus on tax relief. That's their game. The problem is that the tax relief that we've seen from the Conservatives over the last few years has been far more beneficial to wealthy people, to owners of stocks, to the investment community than it is to ordinary salary earners. That's pretty clear. It's not clear what the Liberals intend to do that's very different. For instance, if you say we must have X number of policies, we must have better transportation because middle-class people need these services, somebody has to pay for that. And the people who tend to pay the most are the middle class, because we are the most taxable people in the society. The ones that are least likely to benefit from tax loopholes, like wealthy people. And we know that poor people, they can't pay taxes. They don't earn enough to pay taxes. And any help they get won't be enough to get them into the tax rolls at a level that the middle class already is in.
Well, we know one thing the Liberals did. They went out and they asked Chrystia Freeland to move back from New York to Toronto and become an MP for them, and she won.
Yes,
and
another
there she
former
is.
colleague.
Another, you worked with her too, didn't you?
I did indeed, and Christy is very smart and has some good ideas, and one of her focuses over the last couple of years has been on global inequality, and every developed country is certainly seeing a lot of that right now.
Research from the Library of Parliament since January 1st of last year, January 1st, 2013, they checked out the leaders and their speeches. Justin Trudeau has used the phrase middle class 52 times in the House of Commons. Stephen Harper has apparently said it twice. Tom Mulcair has said it 9 times. Do you read anything into any of that?
Well, I do. I think that's, again, the Obama message that's come to Canada. I mean, the middle class is considered to be a great open space for a reborn Liberal Party, because there are a lot of people in the middle, regardless of how you define that middle, who don't feel good about the way the economy's been going. They don't feel good about conservative policies, and they particularly worry. As we saw today, there was another report saying that Canada has an unbalanced economy. It's too resource heavy, too dependent on very small segment of the productive capacity, and it needs to fix these problems, or we're going to have more economic problems down the road.
Was that a report just in today, or just in 50 years ago? I think we've been saying that for half a century, haven't
somebody or other has been saying that all along, and it happens to be true. But in the middle class, the segment that Mr. Trudeau is specifically targeting, you have the vast number of baby boomers and the elderly, both of whom vote regularly and often. Younger people, who are obviously part of the NDP pitch, don't tend to vote as much, nor do they have the same interests as homeowners in suburbia. The Conservatives did very well with those suburban homeowners for a while, but now they're feeling squeezed. Well, if they're feeling squeezed and your party doesn't seem to be wanting to do much for them, you're going to switch. And it's easy ideologically to switch, because there's no ideologically stable middle class where you can say all of these people are liberal or they're all small c conservative. That just doesn't exist anymore. So you have to carve a piece out party by party.
I do want to return to that number you gave earlier in the program, where you said 47% of people in this country now consider themselves middle class. That's an ECOS polling number, and that's down. And I want to pick up on that from this perspective. In 2006, it was 2/3 of Canadians who considered themselves to be middle class. Now, as you point out, 47%. If fewer and fewer Canadians think that they are middle class and think of themselves now more as poor or working class Canadians, should politicians be reevaluating that pitch to the middle class, since it sounds like it's a dwindling market?
Well, except that it's still a huge number of people. And the pitch isn't just targeted at people in the middle class. It's targeted at people who aspire to be in the middle class, because that was the old Canadian dream. I want to get into the middle class. I want a home that I own. I want a cottage if possible. I certainly want a car, and I want a good education for my children. That's the dream. And the people who aspire to get into that group, the people who no longer think that they are part of the middle class, are the new workers. They're part-time, or they're working at the bottom levels. A lot of them are self-employed and they don't feel they're earning enough. They certainly can't afford to buy homes at inflated prices, so you're seeing home ownership levels, home ownership's being put off now much longer than it used to be. People are worried about debt, because there's a huge amount of household debt in this country. All those people fit into the category. Either they aspire to get there, or they're already there and they're worried about being knocked out.
The checklist you just gave, the Canadian dream, right? Family, house, car, annual vacation, that kind of thing. That's the Canadian dream I think we all sort of grew up expecting. Is that what it is today, do you think?
Well, I think the dream has probably changed to some extent, but when we go out and interview people and they tell us, you know, I haven't been able to take a vacation in 5 years because I can no longer afford foreign travel. That's striking, because at one time that was the aspiration of the middle class. You could do those things. You weren't rich, but you could do some of the things that rich people used to do on a regular basis. And you could feel that you had the ability to do that, and you didn't have to go into debt to do it. Now you have to borrow to do those things in many cases. So you get those horrible credit card bills, and you carry way more debt than you used to because it's so much easier to carry it.
At what rate of interest?
At huge rates of interest. Credit card debt is ridiculous. Nobody should have it, but they do because they still aspire to those material things. Now, we can argue whether those are good or bad, but it's those material demands that built this economy.
Is the Canadian dream the same thing, in your view, as the American dream?
Well, the American dream was much more centered, actually, on home ownership than Canadian dream for many years, to such an extent that government consciously went out and said, even if you're poor, you should have the right to own a home. And we're going to see that you do it by compelling financial institutions to make sure you get the money. And we'll backstop all that. And that's, of course, what led to the
Fannie and Freddie.
Exactly. That's what started all that.
So that's the biggest distinction between Canadian government policy and American government policy vis-a-vis the Canadian dream or the American dream.
Well, the Americans had a problem because as actual income levels were falling, to make the dream work, you had to make all those other things financeable. And the cheapest way to do that was to get people into housing that they could afford, and the only way they could afford that was with government aid. And that was a conscious decision to, first of all, it's in the interest of social stability, for one thing, to get people out of slum dwellings and into decent housing. So that was conscious, but you don't see that in many other parts of the world. Home ownership is not usually at the top of the list in many parts of the world, but it was in the United States. And in Canada, it sort of became the holy grail when the big suburban development happened after World War II. But nobody in government went out and said, if you can't afford it, we'll still do it. Here they basically said, well, you have to be able to afford it at least.
A couple of minutes left. Let's try and tackle a couple of more things here. Conference Board of Canada graded Canada and gave Canada a C in income inequality, ranking 12th out of 17 peer countries. What do you think the state of social mobility in the country is today?
Well, I think social mobility is an increase. It's better in Canada than in the United States, if that's where we're comparing, but it's still more problematic. It's getting much tougher to move up. It's easier to move down. All that takes is more job cuts, and you're going to move down that ladder. It's also tougher to move laterally across Canada because the government keeps saying, well, there's lots of jobs in Alberta, so just go there. It's very tough for people who have deep family ties and social commitments in other parts of the country to just pick up stakes and go. And the ones who do it, and certainly we've seen that from Newfoundlanders for decades, they do it out of dire circumstances. You're not going to get middle-class Ontarians, as a rule, saying, I'm just going to pick up and go to Alberta because that's where my fortune's going to be. You will see younger people doing it, but they've always done that.
So is the Canadian dream in jeopardy today, in your view?
Well, I think if the Canadian dream is to own a house in an upscale neighborhood in Toronto or Vancouver, you're going to have to delay that goal for a lot longer than you might have otherwise.
Or have rich parents who help you out.
Yes, and that, unfortunately, is also traditional. But it doesn't mean that you'll never achieve it, but it does mean that the economy has to be broader, and they have to have real growth in this economy, and not just in one part of this economy, to get more people into the middle class and into home ownership.
You know a lot about this, so we're glad we invited you in today, but you know even more about baseball. And in our last 10 seconds here, who's going to win the World Series this year?
Talking about a middle-class sport, baseball is the quintessential middle-class sport, still the most affordable major sport.
Can go down to the Sky Dome and watch a Jays game, Major League Baseball, for $10 a ticket.
Well, exactly.
Who's going to win the World Series
Whereas you need to
year?
be rich to see the Leafs.
You got that right.
I still think it's going to be Boston, but I'm going to secretly be rooting for Toronto because I know you hate that.
I don't mind that at all. If the Blue Jays win, that's fine.
Okay.
Now that the Red Sox have won 3 of the last 10, that's fine. That's Brian Milner from the Globe and Mail. Brian, great seeing you again. Thanks.
Same here.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.